She's also active as a tutor for undergraduate and honors science students, and active in a variety of societies, including the Muslim Students Postgraduate Society and the Science Faculty Society. So welcome, Ragima. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Hi. So how can you tell whether or not an organism such as a plant or an animal is dead or alive? Chances are that your answer will depend on the presence or absence of a discernible rhythm, such as a pulsating pulse or the beating of the heart. And if any of you were in close proximity to me now, you would know that my heart is throbbing, so I'm definitely alive. So, good morning. As Fenwala introduced me, I am Rahima Joseph, and I will be introducing you to circadian rhythms, one of the most common biological rhythms that is present in nature. So biological rhythms are defined as changes in biological processes that occur with a repeated pattern, that is repeated at regular intervals. Examples of these rhythms include heartbeat, brain waves or brain activity, as well as respiration. These different forms of rhythms are present in an array of organisms, ranging from your simple bacteria to your more complex organisms such as humans. And at any given time, any living entity experiences a combination of different biological rhythms. So rotation of the Earth about its axis leads to periodic changes that define a 24-hour cycle of light alternating with darkness. And as a result, you have an array of associated environmental changes that accompany this light-dark changes, such as increased temperatures that's associated with the daytime, and your decreased temperatures that's associated with the nighttime. And these environmental changes are important for the perception of biological timing. It sort of gives us an idea of where we are relative to our environment and what our body should be doing to improve fitness and adaptation. So we spoke about this ever-changing environment, and have you ever thought about how we cope with this? How do our bodies know when it's daytime, when it's nighttime, when certain hormones need to be released to promote growth or to promote sleep? And we have evolved an endogenous timekeeping mechanism known as the circadian clock. And this circadian clock measures time by perceiving external environmental signals, such as light, dark, or changes in temperature. It allows organisms such as humans, animals, and plants to match their bodily processes to the natural time-dependent changes of the environment. And as a result, biological processes will occur at a time of day that is most beneficial to that specific organism. Furthermore, the circadian clock allows us to anticipate certain environmental changes based on recurring exposures. So your body sort of knows even before dawn sets in, it knows that in a few hours dawn will set in, and the body sets in motion all those processes that are required for us to be active during the light period. So our circadian clocks can be divided into three basic units. We have an input pathway, and this is the pathway that perceives environmental changes such as light, dark, or temperature, and it takes that information pertaining to time and the external environment and transfers it to the core clock. And one important thing to note is that in humans, the core of the circadian clock sits in the brain, and in other organisms, they might not have a core clock, or their core clocks might be situated at a different place. And the core clock generates these biological rhythms that match the time-dependent changes of the environment. Lastly, we have an output pathway. And the output pathway conveys information pertaining to time throughout the entire organism. So it detects light and dark, and so the body then knows it is time for me to either be awake and active or to prepare for sleep. Okay? So one way to think of the circadian clock is to use the analogy of a normal clock. Right? So our conventional clocks consist of a series of bars and wheels that are arranged such that the teeth-like projections match into one another. And when you turn the dial, you can adjust the time and the cogs move at the same pace, right? But if the cogs don't match up properly, you can't set the time and you can't perceive the time either. So that is the exact same way in which our circadian clocks work. They're regulated by a set of clock genes that are either expressed or repressed at particular times over a 24-hour period. And these clock genes contain instructions that act as switches to ensure that biological processes come to pass at the correct or appropriate time of day. The absence, presence, or excessive amounts of any of these components could reduce or abolish the functionality of our circadian clocks. So a number of processes in the human body are reliant on a functional circadian clock. So over here, this diagram is just showing at the top from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., that's your night phase, and then 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., that would be considered your day phase. And as you can see, certain processes occur at a set time of day to enhance adaptiveness of the organism to the environment as well as improved fitness. And one example of that is the secretion and repression of secretion of a hormone known as melatonin. So melatonin is commonly referred to as the hormone of darkness because its secretion coincides with the onset of darkness, and it serves as a time giver to the body that we are now entering the night phase, and all the processes required for functionality during the night has to be set in motion. And then about 12 hours or so later, at around 8 a.m., melatonin secretion stops, and this is because the body perceives light, so via the input pathway perceives light, it gets sent to the core clock in the brain, and as a result, it sends information throughout the whole body that we are now in daytime, and all the processes that are required for functionality during the day needs to be set in motion. Okay, and this diagram basically depicts an individual whose internal clock is aligned with the external environment. But we know that we live in an industrialized society. So shift work has become a very important part of our lives, and it's required to sustain the economy in some instances. And in that case, a lot of people's circadian clocks become misaligned with the external environment, such that they now perceive light at night when the body doesn't expect to perceive any light. And as you can see, melatonin secretion depends on that darkness. So you're now influencing that secretion of melatonin, and you might have adverse effects to the rest of the body. So the next time you decide to use that tablet at night when you should be asleep, please remember that essentially you're going against your biological clock. Okay. And then this is just a graphical representation to show you how the secretion of melatonin changes over time. On the y-axis, we have the amount of melatonin in picograms per mole, and down here we have a 24-hour period. And you can see from at 12 midnight, you have this baseline levels of melatonin, and around about 8 p.m. in the evening, that's our dark phase, melatonin secretion starts to increase, peaking between midnight and 4 a.m., after which it starts to decrease, reaching its normal daytime low levels. And this is over a period of 24 hours. And if you were to measure this over several days, you would see that same pattern. It would persist because this secretion and inhibition of melatonin secretion is driven by that endogenous circadian clock. Okay, and then we spoke about incorrect perception of time due to a dysfunctional clock. So for example, if your daily activities include, let's say, shift work, you have this misalignment between your endogenous clock and the external environment, you will alter the secretion pattern of melatonin. Or if you are exposing yourself to light-emitting devices at night. And that can have adverse effects on other bodily functions. So unlike humans, plants are sessile organisms, and they don't have the option of fight or flight. It is always fight, right? And they live in dynamic environments that are constantly changing. They are exposed to an array of different environmental elements such as extreme heat or cold, and that's associated with things like drought or flooding. They're also exposed to biotic stresses such as pathogen attack, insect attack, and herbivory. And for plants to be primed to defend themselves against all these stresses all the time is energetically expensive, and it would come at a cost. And generally, there's a trade-off between growth and defense against environmental stresses. So if you have constitutive activation of all of these defenses, your growth and development lags behind. Okay. So one way that plants are able to use their energy much more efficiently is by having the circadian clock, right? And as you mentioned before, in humans you have the primary clock, which is situated in the brain, but because plants are sessile and they are unable to move, they have this added advantage of having multiple independent clocks in every single tissue and every single organ, so that each part of the plant is able to respond appropriately to whatever environmental stress it encounters. And the importance of the circadian clock is that it allows plants to anticipate when certain stresses will occur. So this diagram over here, it's basically just showing a 24-hour cycle. The yellow denotes the day and the blue denotes the night. And this is just showing at different times of day when the plant can anticipate things like maximum cold stress or drought stress or osmotic and heat stress. So the circadian clock allows the plants to anticipate the time of day at which they are most likely to encounter these stresses. And as a result, they will prime those responses at a time of day when it's most needed. So responses to these elements won't be activated all the time. So you now have energy being used both for growth and for response to environmental stresses, both biotic and abiotic. Yes.
What do you mean with functional independent? Does that mean that they're irrespective of the exposure?
Yeah. So in humans, we have our primary clock situated in the anterior hypothalamus, right? And this primary clock sort of sets the time for all of the other clocks in our other organs. So that clock perceives the time and it tells the clocks in the liver, may you please adjust accordingly. But plants don't have a single primary clock. There's no hierarchical arrangement. Every single organ and tissue has its own clock. I don't know if that answers the question clearly.
And are they independent of the exposure?
No. So it's always dependent of exposure. The clock gets set by the exposure. Yes. Later on we'll expand on that more. Is there someone else had a question? No. Okay. So as we saw in humans, a number of processes are regulated by the circadian clock. The same holds true for plants. And this diagram is just showing an example of plant processes that are regulated by the clock and occur at a specific time of day. These include things like petal opening. Petals open at certain times of day and then they are closed at other times of day. Leaf movement, this also changes throughout the day. The leaves don't stay fully expanded. They move to make maximum use of the resources available in the environment. And the same holds true for the stomata. The stomatal aperture changes throughout the day so that the plant is able to make a maximum use of all the resources that are available to it. And in the slides that will be coming later, we will look at some of these examples and exactly how the circadian clock regulates them. Okay. So in the beginning, we mentioned that there are an array of biological rhythms. So there are certain fundamental properties that sort of distinguishes circadian rhythms from other biological rhythms. And these include things like active synchronization to the external environment. So the light-dark signals or changes in temperature, that is used to set the clock. And if you just think about something like traveling, when you travel abroad and you cross time zones, you're now exposed to different light-dark cycles. Your body is able to entrain to that, so it's active synchronization. And then another important question that sort of arose from the question that the gentleman asked in front is the fact that once these rhythms are sort of learnt by a particular organism and you know when to anticipate daylight or darkness and the associated processes, these rhythms will persist. So if you place an organism in a constant light or constant dark conditions, the rhythms will still persist because the plant will anticipate those changes even though they are now not actively exposed to those environmental changes. And then lastly, and most importantly, circadian rhythms have a period of approximately 24 hours. It will take 24 hours for a particular cycle to complete itself. Okay. So one of the first experiments that were conducted, or pseudoscience experiments that were conducted to prove that leaf movement is driven by an endogenous circadian clock, was carried out by Jacques de Morin, and I hope I didn't butcher his name. Okay, and he placed a mimosa plant in front of a window, and the plant was exposed to light during the day, and it was exposed to darkness during the night. And he noticed that during the day, when plants were exposed to light, the leaves were fully expanded, and during the night, the leaves were folded. Right? And he noticed this observation for several days. And he wanted to know what sort of drives this folding and unfolding of these leaflets. Is it signals that are received from the external environment, or is it something that is also endogenously driven? He then proceeded to move those same plants into a constant dark chamber. I think it was a cupboard in this case, a constant dark cupboard. So previously they were exposed to light-dark cycles, and now they had no time cues. They were exposed to no time cues. And he found that when plants would normally be exposed to light, their leaves would sort of unfold in anticipation of the new dawn. And when dusk would set in, the leaves would fold again. And he thought it's quite surprising. They are now not exposed to these environmental signals, but this leaf movement behavior still persists. And most importantly, he found that these movements were anticipated. So even a few hours before dawn or dusk set in, these leaf movements already set in motion. So the leaves would be fully expanded before dawn sets in, and they would start folding before dusk sets in. So he sort of provided the groundwork for a lot of other researchers to build on this and find out how this intrinsic clock works and how these endogenous rhythms are maintained. So on that side, figure A and figure B, we are now looking at leaves that were previously exposed to light-dark cycles, and then they were placed into constant conditions. In this case, they were exposed to constant light conditions. And you can see during the night, the leaves are sort of folded close, and during the day, they fully expanded, right? And this has an adaptive advantage. During the day, they want to maximize surface area to obtain energy from the sun. And during the night, it's thought that they sort of curl away to shield themselves from the cold that's associated with decreased temperatures. And this graph down here is just showing the leaf movement over several days. And the trough down here represents leaves that are expanded, and the peak represents the leaves that are closed. And you can see as the day progresses, the leaves in the beginning of the day, the leaves are expanded, and as the day progresses, the leaves sort of close, and this pattern is repeated over several days, right? And this is in constant light conditions, providing further evidence that this sort of rhythmic leaf movement is driven by an endogenous clock. And then one of the main things that biologists or molecular biologists loves doing is they love mutating things. So if you want to know if the circadian clock is indeed involved in a particular process, you go in there and you either knock it out, so you remove one of those cogs, or you add excess amounts of the cogs to see whether or not that rhythmic leaf movement will still be maintained. And up here, we have the wild-type plant, and wild-type, for the purposes of this talk, will just refer to plants that have functional clocks, and mutants will refer to plants that have dysfunctional clocks, so excess amounts of the cogs or those clock genes. And you can see in the wild-type plant, you have this nice rhythmic leaf movement that's maintained over 4 days. However, in the mutant, in the plants that lack a functional circadian clock, there's no discernible rhythm in their leaf movement. And this also has some implications for growth. Okay. Then Carl von Linné was obsessed with designing the perfect garden that would allow people to tell the time. And this was based on the fact that certain plants open and close, or certain flowers rather, open and close their petals at different times of the day. And so he proposed, if you were to walk into a garden and place plants in such a way that the time at which their petals open and close sort of coincides with the time as the day progresses, you could walk into a garden, look at which petals are open, and tell which time of day it was. But there were a lot of flaws with that, okay? So what are the importance of regulating the time of day at which your leaves or your petals open and close? You need to ensure that they open and close at a time of day that coincides with the prevalence of whatever pollinators are needed to promote progression, right? And the times of petal opening and closing varies among different species, and they also vary as the year progresses, right? So now I have a question for the audience, and I have some lovely treats up here for those of you who can have these treats. So Carl von Linné wanted to set up this floral clock. So walk into a garden, look at which petals or flowers are open, and then predict the time from that. Is anybody able to tell me what are the problems with trying to generate a clock like that?
Sunflowers?
You could use sunflowers, yes, but what problems would you encounter? So I'll give... Yeah, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. The seasons, as the season changes, the day length changes, so the time at which plants open and close their petals change. So a plant that might open its petals, let's say, at 6 a.m. in winter will open its petals at a different time in summer. So that is one of the key problems that they had with generating this floral clock. However, in an ideal laboratory conditions, you could do that because you have a chamber and you can set, lights go on at 6 a.m. and lights go off at, let's say, 6 p.m. So I'll give the lady the banana. Okay. So may I give you the cookie?
Yes.
Okay. Please don't blame me if you're not allowed to eat sweet things. Okay. 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 So we know the importance of flowering time. Scientists decided to take this further. They wanted to go and see, which component per se of the circadian clock is important for this timed flowering. And they found that there's this component, or one of the cogs, that's called ALF3. That's important for floral timing. And when you have your wild-type plant, it is able to perceive time correctly. It's able to know when it needs to flower, and that flowering coincides with ideal environmental conditions as well as the prevalence of pollinators. And when you have a dysfunctional clock, so when you sort of tinker with that cog called ALF3, you have premature flowering. So that's completely out of sync with ideal environmental conditions. Okay, and then sunflowers. Okay, so the young sunflowers, the orientation of sunflowers is also regulated by the circadian clock, and they sort of track the movement of the sun over a 24-hour period. So at dawn, they're facing eastward, and as the day progresses and the sun moves across the sky, they track the movement of the sun across the sky, ending up facing in a westward direction, and in anticipation of the new dawn, they sort of flip back to an eastward direction so that they are able to gain maximum exposure to sunlight when the new dawn sets in. So these researchers wanted to show that this is indeed a process that is endogenously driven. So they took these sunflowers, they grew, I think it was in the field, they were allowed to track the sun back and forth for several days. And then they wanted to see, like the leaf movement, are these plants able to maintain this sort of tracking movement? So they placed them in a chamber with a fixed light source, so no movement of the sun. And those same plants, despite having that fixed light source that was not moving, they still displayed that movement from east to west for several days, further providing evidence that that movement is driven by something that is intrinsic, and it was reliant on that entrainment, that prior exposure to light-dark cycles, and knowing the movement of the sun as it progresses throughout the day. Then they want to, so we also mentioned previously that circadian rhythms have a period of approximately 24 hours, so that movement of the sun takes approximately 24 hours, and they wanted to see what happens if we lengthen the day. So if we have like a 30-hour day, what will the plants do? So down here, they have, so T24 stands for 24-hour day cycles, and T30, 30-day cycles. And you can see when you have these 24-hour day cycles, you have this nice, robust movement of sunflowers that's tracking the sun as it progresses. But when you have this 30-day period, the rhythms are not as robust and as discernible as a 24-hour cycle. And what they also noted was that when you increase the length of the day and the plants sort of don't know whether they're coming or they're going and which way to move, they also had reduced biomass. So by not having a time or a day, a 24-hour day that's synchronized with the external environment, plants also exhibited growth defects. So that ability to synchronize with the external environment is important for things like growth, both in plants and humans. Okay. And then we mentioned previously that mounting an immune response is energetically taxing. And because plants have the circadian clock, they are able to anticipate the time of day when a particular pathogen or disease-causing agent will be in abundance, right? And so over here, we're just looking at the ability of the plant to defend itself against Botrytis cinerea, and I know you all have had this growing in your fridge. That's at one point or another. It's looking at the plant's ability to defend itself against this fungus at different times of the day. So this figure up here, it's just showing inoculation at dawn, so during the day period, and you can see this translucent bit is an indication of disease progression. So the smaller the translucent area, the stronger the immune response, and the greater the translucent area, the weaker the immune response. So when plants were infected or challenged during the daytime, they had small lesion sizes, indicating a strong immune response, and when they were infected with this fungus at night, they had larger lesion sizes, indicating that the immune response was not as robust during the night. And this is because the circadian clock tells the plant during the day, and you need to know that this particular pathogen will be around in abundance, so heighten that immune response. And during the night, that particular pathogen won't be as prevalent, so you don't need to divert all the energy resources to defense. You may now use it for something else. Okay. And then over here, this is just a graphical representation of that figure. So again, we have our wild type plant, And on the y-axis over there, it's showing the lesion size. When you infect the plants during the day, you have a smaller lesion, stronger immune response. When they are infected during the night, you have a weaker immune response. And when you look at plants with a dysfunctional circadian clock, they are not able to perceive information about time and respond appropriately. They are equally susceptible to this fungus, irrespective of the time of day. So information like this is quite important for agricultural practices because crops are developing increased resistance to pesticides and fungicides. So if you're able to determine the time of day that plants are more susceptible or more resistant to a particular disease-causing agent, you can adjust the times at which you would apply that particular insecticide or pesticide. So what do you do when the nature gives you mixed signals? So things like climate change. It's altering that natural rhythmic nature of the environment, right? And a whole bunch of biological processes such as flowering, search behavior of pollinators, and migratory patterns of birds are all influenced by these environmental factors. And so they tend to change as the climate changes. And these abnormal variations in the climate may cause mismatches in the timing of certain interactions, such as that exhibited between plants and their pollinators, and these could alter ecosystems. But the circadian clock allows the plant to adjust to these changes, right? Ensuring that certain processes change to accommodate the changes in the environment, such as was seen with increased temperatures promote earlier flowering times. Most organisms differentiate their activity along temporal gradients of day and night. And we have this whole artificial light thing. We do it as well with our cell phones. And if you just think about street lamps, certain plants are exposed to light at night, and that sort of confuses the plant because now you're telling the plant, may you please activate all the biological processes that are associated with the day. And that could be a problem, right? But the circadian clock has this mechanism called gating, and it protects the plant against perceiving light at incorrect times of day. So even if you were to expose a plant to light at night, if it knows that habitually during the dark phase I should not be getting light, and over this seasonal period the dark phase extends for several hours, if you were to expose it to light, it is able to gate and block the light from sending signals to the circadian clock and to making all the changes that are associated with light signals. Okay. And then just to wrap up with some key points and reminders, we live in a rhythmic environment and we follow a daily timetable of approximately 24 hours of light alternating with darkness. We have this internal biological clock that allows us to detect these environmental changes and also adapt our biology to suit the changes in the environment so that we are able to thrive, right? And in humans, as Dale Ray will come and speak to you about the general health effects and the effects that having a circadian clock will have on fitness. Thank you very much. I have a cookie for the first person that has a question.
You to start falling asleep at 8 o'clock when it gets dark rather than at 10 or 11 when you're watching TV or whatever?
So the question was, you live in a city and you have this 24-hour light-dark cycle, and now you move to a secluded area and the light-dark cycle is changed. How long does it take for you to adjust to these environmental changes? Okay, so it depends. And Del Rey will speak about that. for different people, it might be different, right? So all of our body clocks are not exactly aligned or ideally aligned with the external environment, but it could take several hours. I speak under correction, maybe even 6 hours or so, depending on which process you're looking at. Because what you need to keep in mind is that your body perceives now that it's darkness when I should be getting light. So what's happening? So it might try and counter that darkness signal, but because you're now staying in the secluded environment for an extended period, it realizes I have to re-entrain to this. So it will take time for the body to adjust that rhythm in the core clock, and then send that signal to all the other independent clocks in the other organs. So that might take a while. So if I were to have to tell you the exact time, I would be lying. I can't tell you the exact time. It might vary depending on what you are looking at. If you're looking at a clock in the liver, it might take a while for that to adjust, and it might take longer than it would take for, let's say, clocks that are associated with other metabolic processes. May you please pass this to the gentleman? Thank you. Yes.
Two questions.
Okay.
The memory of the plant, if it's put in a dark room, and how long will it keep moving from side to side? Will it eventually give up?
Yes.
Secondly, if you move to a 30-hour day, will it learn a new rhythm around 30 hours and then adjust and get into synchronization with that?
Okay. So the question was, with plants, if it has the normal 24-hour rhythm, and you move it, or 24-hour day cycle, and you now move it to, let's say, a 30-hour cycle, right?
Put in the dark room. The cupboard.
Yes, you put it in a dark room.
Keep moving.
Yes, sorry. You put it in a dark room. How long will that rhythmic movement persist? That was the first question. Yes. So the answer is, I can definitely say yes, because I've done an experiment like that. So I grew plants up in a 24-hour day cycle, so 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark for 1 week. So from seed, they grew up in that 12-hour light dark, and they learned that they need to raise their leaves when it's dark and then fully expand them when it's light. And then I placed them into constant light conditions for a period of about like 5 to 7 days. And for the first 5 or so days, those rhythms persist and they're quite strong. And after that, they sort of just dampen, right? They just don't persist anymore. That's the one question. The other question was about extended day. Yeah. So you normally have a 24-hour day, and now you're moving your plant to a 30-hour day. How do they sort of cope with that changes? And if you were to place them back, would they be okay?
Keep it 30 hours, they learn a new rhythm.
Or they learn a new rhythm. So I think, one, it depends on the age of the plants. If you grow a plant in a 30-hour day cycle from seed, it's easier for them to learn that rhythm because that's all they are exposed to, and that becomes a natural habit. But if you were to take a plant from 24-hour cycle, and depending on the age, that's also very important. If you were to move the plants when they are very young to a 30-hour day, chances are that they might be able to cope well and learn that this is a 30-hour day cycle, I need to adjust, right? But if you were to move an older plant to a 30-hour day cycle, they might struggle to adjust. And the same holds true for elderly. Okay, sorry, does that answer your question? Okay.
It's partly a question that somewhere in the vicinity of Oudtshoorn, I remember visiting a farm where they had flashlights or LED lights on the plants during the night. I think it was hop, but I'm not quite sure. But the question is, what would be the effect on circadian clocks, if any, on the plant which are continuously under light conditions?
Okay.
And would it be adverse eventually?
So the answer is yes. Continuous light exposure is not something that's good. It will have adverse growth effects. So excessive light is also a form of stress. So the plant will then try and counter that constant light exposure. And in the process, it will have less energy diverted towards growth. Right? So that's one way. The other thing that happens is that plants sort of develop these necrotic lesions, so like bleaching of the leaves when they are exposed to excessive light. And then in terms of the circadian clock, I think with that continuous exposure of light at night and both during the day when you have natural light, if you have that recurring behavior, it will definitely mess up the plant circadian clock, because it can only gate for so long. Because remember, the clock is there to adjust to environmental changes. And now you have light at night when plants should not be perceiving light, and you also have light during the day. And that happens all the time. So the plant's mind, or clock, is set to adjust to those changes. So at the end of the day, all those day processes will always be turned on. And if you think about things like immune responses, they are heightened during the day when particular pests are more prevalent. So the plants will always be primed. I need to fight. But it's nighttime, and there's no pests around because you just have artificial light and you're thinking that it's day.
Yeah.
So,
yet it's done to promote production. Would it eventually kill the plants or what?
So it depends. Are these plants genetically modified? You do get plants that are...
No, they will not.
Okay, so from my experience, and I could be wrong, if you were to expose them to excessive light, you will reduce the lifespan. You do get some instances where you're able to genetically modify a plant such that it is better able to cope with certain stresses. So you get drought tolerance plants or heat tolerance plants. So it all depends on, one, whether or not they are genetically modified. The other question is, what light intensity are these plants being exposed to? Are they the same as the light intensity that they are exposed to during the day? Because plants are also able to detect different wavelengths of light. So that's actually an important thing that I forgot to mention, is that even though they are being exposed to that light, what is the wavelength? Is it the same as the wavelength of light that they are exposed to during the day? So it might be that they are able to distinguish between that natural daylight and the light that's being exposed at night.
I've got another question, but you probably will deal with that. And the human circadian rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between people who live in the tropical equator area and higher up towards the pole, where the lighting is completely different, and the temperature as well. You probably will treat that, discuss that later.
Yes, so that will be touched on by Dale Ray, but that would also, our circadian clocks will be very different, because you're in a different place, your environment changes in a very different rhythmic manner compared to people that are in other regions. But definitely the circadian clocks would be different for people situated in different parts of the world. Yes, ma'am, with the floddle. Yeah.
So I was thinking about watering plants. So in a natural environment where a plant's growing, maybe it's dry during the day, it would maybe then adjust itself to know that it's not going to get water. So you would think maybe you shouldn't water that time because the plant's not expecting water. And then my question following that is like, so you think of growing vines and maybe drip fertilization. Does a plant then get into a circadian rhythm where it knows it's going to be watered at 6 o'clock every morning? I mean, have any studies been done about that?
Okay. So the first question was, so plants would generally expect to receive water at a particular time of day based on the external environment, so they know that, let's say, during the day you will have less access to, let's say, water with increased heat versus other times of the day. That was the first question, right? And how do plants cope with that? So the plants will learn certain habitual behaviors. It will become natural to them. So they'll know, I expect water at this time of day. Let me, open up my stomata or close my stomata.
So I'm basically saying that you shouldn't suddenly go and water it when
Yeah.
not be a good idea. So
It depends on the kind of plant. So even if you were to water it, then you'd have to stick to that routine. If you stick to that particular routine for long enough, and the plant learns that routine from young, it will learn your routine and will adjust to your routine. But if it was exposed to a different routine and now you're switching, it might take some time to adjust to that routine, and it also depends on the age of the plant, because the age strongly influences the ability of a particular plant or even humans to entrain to a new pattern. And then your second question, sorry?
was, like commercially grown vineyards, the same thing. So plants obviously have a circadian rhythm according to when they get watered, they're going to get watered, especially as maybe they
answer as to whether or not particular studies have been done on that per se, but from what I know, I would say that they would be able to learn that particular habit of when you would be watering your plants. And there was another question in the back, yes.
To ask, in plants as well as in humans, what happens to the circadian cycle functioning with aging?
With aging. Okay, so certain, we call them like, for example, circadian parameters. So for example, we have a period of 24 hours, and if I just go back to I'll use this as an example. Oh no, not this one. Let's use, okay. So if we look at something like, let's say, hormone release, when you are, as you age, things like your circadian amplitude, so if we look at the extent of melatonin secretion or the amount of melatonin secretion, things like that could become reduced. They won't be as robust. Your sleep-wake patterns, generally you would be sleeping during the night and you'll be awake during the day, and that sort of habit will be quite rhythmic if you maintain a healthy lifestyle. But as you age, it will become less robust because you also have different comorbidities that are associated with aging, and all of those reduce your circadian rhythms. So for example, as you age, your ability to adjust to a changing environment, if you were to travel, let's say, across several time zones, would be very different, if not delayed, compared to a younger person that is able to adjust much faster. So age definitely plays a role. But if you keep like a healthy lifestyle with a strict routine, when it is day, engage in certain activities, expose yourself to light. When it is nighttime, put away those iPads or use some kind of shield so that you dim the exposure of the light to the eyes. Then your body will try as best as possible to keep that circadian clock functional and allow you to still continue thriving. Okay. To plants, sorry?
Yes, what happens then to plants? How do they manifest this reduction of circadian rhythm?
Yeah. So as they age, per se, their leaf movements will change. They won't be as robust. They'll be dampened. So the angle at which they sort of raise and lower their leaves will change as they grow with age. At some point, the flowering time will also change. But the important thing to note is that plants sort of know when their peak viability period is. So they will keep those rhythms sustained until they set seed and set flower. And once that happens, if the rhythms sort of go dampened, it's okay. I've already set out in the world what I need to in order to propagate myself. So why should I still bother? Okay. The man in the back. So the question was, have they done any experiments to find out what the effects of having floodlights on the vegetation on Table Mountain is? I have absolutely no idea whether or not that has been done, but what I can definitely say is that scientists like the neat experiments. So we like to test things in a controlled environment. We have a little growth chamber where we know the lights go on at 6 a.m. and they go off at 6 p.m. If we are investigating something in an open field, we are now opening ourselves up to a whole lot of other elements that we might not even know were around. There might be other pests that could engage with the plant at different times of day that also provide a sort of like a time cue to the plant, and all of those things would then influence the circadian timing of the plant. Yeah. Okay, I doubt that they would, to be honest. Yes.
In theory,
I knew this question was coming. Okay, so I'm still very inexperienced and still learning a lot. But my understanding is that melatonin is the hormone of darkness. Its secretion serves as a signal to the body that it is now nighttime. So I might be wrong, but I don't think that it is melatonin that makes you sleep. When you take melatonin at night, the levels of melatonin will rise in your body and it serves as an indicator. May you please activate all the processes that are required for me to now go to bed. So I don't think it makes you sleep. I think it just serves as a signal for the body to set in motion the processes that are required for sleep. I hope that answers the question.
You actually said, though, that you're going against your biological clock if you take melatonin.
Okay. So some people, I don't know when they prescribe. So first of all, I don't know if people have checked how much melatonin you actually need in order for the body to know it's now nighttime. And I don't know whether or not people get tested for the levels of melatonin in their blood before they get prescribed melatonin. So I'm not sure. So also adding excess amount of a particular hormone could have adverse health effects, but most people seem to swear by melatonin. I don't think the pills make you sleep, in all honesty. Just think it serves as a time cue.
Medically speaking, the use of melatonin to cure or to prevent things is still controversial. I think it's a whole topic in itself.
Yeah.
What happens when you take melatonin, or what time you take it, and how long, and so on. So it's little. Well, it's something known about it, but it's very controversial.
I have one more cookie left if anybody would like it. Anybody? Okay. So I think you would apply it, let's say per se, when it is at its lowest, when the immunity is at its lowest. That's what I would do, yeah. Because during the day, the plant would be able to cope with whatever environmental challenge. So if you're having lots of pests in the environment during the day, the plant is able to cope with that. So I would apply it at night, right? Because I think at that time of day, the plant's immune system is down, energy is diverted elsewhere. For me, that's the time of day I would apply it. Because even if you were to apply it during the day, I'm not sure whether or not that intrinsic immune response would be dampened anyway. It would still be activated. All you're now doing is applying it at a time of day when the plant doesn't need it in any case. So I would apply it at night. That's what I would do. Yes. So the question was, is there an ideal time of day to plant a plant out if you consider all the different environmental factors? I think it would depend on the kind of plant that you're looking at, you know. Which season does the plant thrive in best? You know, do they prefer the longer days or the shorter days? But I don't think the time of day that you transplant a plant should have too much of an effect, because once it's been transplanted, it will be exposed to that new environment repeatedly if it's young enough, and it will then learn to cope and adjust to that changes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Not about plants, sorry.
Okay.
When you take a, say, Dorminol, which is quite a strong sleeping tablet,
Okay.
and you use it for many years, is it possible when you do wean yourself off from a sleep tablet to actually retrain your brain back into a circadian circadian rhythm without, I mean, is the use of sleeping tablets permanent?